Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. Free and fair elections are a critical component of a real democracy, and citizens have long fought for the right to vote and to have their vote counted. But what's less recognized is that the right to vote is more than just choosing your elected officials. It's a human right, and it forms part of civil and political rights. These refer to the right to vote without discrimination and without repression. Today we're going to look at that relationship between political rights, human rights, and the right to vote. And we're very privileged to have with us Father Miguel Concha. Father, thank you so much for being with us today on Interviews from Mexico.
Gracias. Thank you, Laura.
Miguel Concha is the General Director of one of the oldest and most prominent human rights centers here in Mexico, the Fray Francisco de Vitoria Human Rights Center in Mexico City. And he's also a professor at the National Autonomous University. Father Concha, I wanted to start out by asking, you have traditionally focused on the defense of human rights now for over 3 decades in the Human Rights Center. What made you make this decision to focus on the elections this year? And what does that have to do with your work in the human rights field?
Look, Laura, this started in the year 1997, when they were creating autonomous institutions for organizing and overseeing the elections in Mexico. Influenced by our Central American sisters and brothers who were working in El Salvador and Guatemala to end the violence in a peaceful way and establish democratic systems. I was heavily influenced by that, and I published a book that was titled Political Rights as Human Rights. I gave a copy to the then Secretary of Government, who was a friend of mine. He had been the Federal Attorney General before that and President of the National Commission of Human Rights before. And he was the co-founder of the Mexican Human Rights Academy. I'm talking about Dr. Jorge Carpizo MacGregor. I gave him the book, and he told me very enthusiastically, this book has to be presented and distributed. So he organized a forum in the Coyoacán Cultural Center to promote citizen efforts to administer the elections. And I asked Jose Waldenberg, who was the first president of the General Council of the National Election Institute. We still didn't know that he would later become the president of the Council of the first autonomous institution in Mexico to oversee elections.
Para llevar a cabo los procesos electorales, el proceso electoral federal.
So, we held the first presentation of the book that I'd written and coordinated with others in the Coyoacán Cultural Center. And it reflected the influence of the Central Americans who were seeking peace and an end to violence, an end to war in El Salvador and Guatemala. That's how my book was presented, with that title, the only one at the time, Political Rights as Human Rights.
So this was one of the founding concepts of not only the very start of the institutions here in Mexico after 7 decades of one-party rule, but also of establishing the peace agreements and forming democratic institutions in Central America. What were some of the basic precepts that you presented in this book at this time?
Well, really, it was out of the conviction that Central American grassroots leaders had, after fighting so hard for respect for civil rights and also, although not so much yet, also for social rights. They insisted that the right of every person to the free and secret vote, the right of citizens to run for public office, and the right of citizens to have their vote counted and the popular will represented in the processes of representative democracy be fully exercised. It was terrible to see that the political rights were promoted out of the context of violence. And it's a little sad to see that based on civil rights or economic, social, and cultural rights, political rights are not measured, are still not considered human rights in Mexico. They have a lot to do with respect, protection, guarantee, and promotion of all the other rights. A democratic state necessarily has to recognize these rights, has to respect them, and has to protect them from attacks and always promote them.
If this was a concept that was fundamental at the very beginning of creating the democratic institutions, why don't we hear anything about it now? It seems like we hear about the technical aspects of organizing an election, but political rights as human rights doesn't seem to be on the agenda.
Unfortunately, in the coalition's political campaigns in this race, among the candidates, at least among the candidates for the President of the Republic, we're not seeing and we are not hearing them talking about human rights. And this in spite of the fact in the country we have a crisis of human rights, of civil rights.
Yeah, that's one of the things I want to ask you about too, because
of fundamental rights. We don't see them addressing this. I think they're ignorant. They ignore the issue. Look, a few days ago in the Supreme Court of the nation, talking to the judge who was before him, the case of the political constitution of Mexico City that was challenged by the Federal Attorney General's office, especially, and by other federal authorities.
And this was after a long participative process of developing them.
And there, with this judge, we came to the conclusion that many of the objections and constitutional challenges or controversies on constitutionality were because many of the federal government authorities don't know what human rights are. They don't have a knowledge of human rights. They don't understand why so many social organizations today in Mexico interpret their struggles as a fight for human rights, civil rights, political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. They don't understand, they don't know, and for this reason, they don't understand what is happening in society, and they cannot relate to the cause of respect and protection and promotion and guaranteeing of human rights.
And these are the people who govern us.
Exactly.
That's a pretty damning statement.
Well, this judge, this Supreme Court judge, he told me, that's the problem. That's the issue. That's exactly the problem. For this reason, they say that a new constitution that incorporates criteria of human rights is anti-constitutional. Human rights criteria that are already in the federal constitution and international agreements on the protection of human rights. They don't understand the reason for having a new, renewed, and updated constitutional text. The same thing happens in the campaigns. They don't understand. They don't really know what human rights are.
Yet Mexico is one of the countries that has signed the most treaties, international treaties and agreements on human rights, which means that they're part of Mexican law.
Exactly. Mexico is known in the international sphere as a promoter of human rights
How's that image?
because it has approved many of the international agreements on protection of human rights. And furthermore, it has just approved them. It has also recognized them constitutionally and legally. But this is very different from actively assuring that they are carried out in practice and fomenting public policies, among them electoral public policies that really respect human rights. In the electoral public policies, among others, is to respect the vote of the citizens, to develop institutions that guarantee the citizens' right to vote, and to have authorities who understand the issues, who understand the problem, who know the importance of the matter, and really guarantee the rights of the citizenship.
Now that the Human Rights Center is involved in forming citizen observations for the elections, are you seeing a serious problem or threat to democracy as a result of this somehow disconnect between electoral processes in practice and the full recognition and respect for political rights?
Look, yes. I encourage it based on the experience I told you about from 1997. I asked the team that at our center to present a project for electoral observation the election day. And 2 or 3 days afterwards, during the vote count, with 3 lines of action, First, to actually carry out election observation, registering ourselves with the National Elections Institute, and organizing elections observation in 20 districts with 70 national observers, Mexican, and also 20 international observers. They were to be registered and filed within the National Electoral Institute. The other line is that the elections observation, you have to do it, you have to start before the day of the vote, observing the electoral process and making public complaints, and also formal complaints of all the illegalities that are observed before the electoral process, during and after the process, to file the complaints to the public office and institutions that in principle should guarantee fair and clean elections. This is the second line.
And then they have to investigate those complaints.
Exactly, that's right. And they're investigating how, in practical terms, it affects freedom of the vote. How does it meddle with the electoral process, right? The other line is to get the word out, to publicize our work, the complaints, to reach to the public through national media, and also to go to the international media. And so, what we've been seeing in this, along with other civil society organizations, not many, other organizations in the current Mexican electoral process, there are forms that are repeated to distort democracy.
Not just in this election.
Like, for example, voter coercion and vote buying, inducing other people's votes, unduly influencing their electoral preferences, their candidate preferences, especially with individuals who are dependent for reasons of employment, or even not just deceiving them, but others imposing a point of view, not letting individuals free to consider and make their own decisions.
Like employers.
Exactly. So we're already seeing situations that pervert representative democracy to benefit powerful interests. Not the interest or the sovereignty of the people, not the interest of the public's right to have their decisions respected, but rather sectoral, particular interests. There's a lot of pressure and vote buying and voter coercion.
Well, if everything worked the way it was supposed to, first of all, you wouldn't have these practices, which have been documented in elections for years and yet don't seem to change. And second of all, you would assume that the electoral authorities would be able to control them, perhaps prevent them, and at least sanction them when they do occur. The idea of mobilizing citizens, is that because you don't entirely have faith that the electoral authorities can do their job?
Yeah. Look, it's not that I'd like to be indiscreet, But last
La
week,
semana pasada, yo tuve la
I had the
oportunidad
chance
de estar en una
to be
sesión con
in a session with
varios expertos
several
en
experts
temas
in electoral issues.
electorales y preocupados también
They were
por
also
la
concerned
limpieza
with how
electoral,
clean the elections could be,
también muy
and
preocupados
also
por
very
la
concerned
actuación
with the behavior of the
del
National Electoral
Tribunal
Institute,
Electoral,
of the Specialized
de la
Prosecutor's
Fiscalía
Office
Especial para
for
Delitos
Electoral Crimes,
Electorales,
of the Electoral Tribunal,
Electoral, del
of
Poder
the
Judicial
judiciary branch
muy
of the
preocupados.
federal government. They were really
Y
worried.
Porfirio Muñoz Ledo,
And Porfirio Muñoz Ledo,
un compañero mexicano,
a colleague,
abogado, internacionalista,
Mexican lawyer,
con
internationalist with
muchos
many
años
years
en
of
el
experience
gobierno,
working for change in Mexico.
por el cambio en México,
He's a
un
man
hombre
committed to democracy.
comprometido con la democracia.
Yeah, we had the opportunity to interview him here on the show.
Entonces,
So
le dijo
he
al
said
presidente
to
del
the director of the National
Lorenzo
Electoral
Córdoba,
Institute, Lorenzo Córdoba,
tú eres un
you are
órgano de
an
Estado,
institution of the state.
no eres
You are
un
not
órgano de
a
gobierno.
government institution.
Tú eres
You
un
are
órgano
an
de
institution
Estado,
of the state.
y en los
And in
procesos
elections,
electorales,
you are the
tú
maximum
eres
authority.
la máxima autoridad. Tú tienes a los
You have
demás
the other
poderes
powers of government
bajo
under
tu
your mandate.
mando. Incluso en otros
In some countries,
países, como Venezuela, por
like
ejemplo,
Venezuela, for example,
hay poder ejecutivo,
there is a
poder
legislative
legislativo,
power, the executive
poder
power,
judicial
the
y
judicial
poder
power, and the
electoral.
electoral power.
En México tenemos
In
al
Mexico,
INE,
we have the National
tenemos
Electoral
la
Institute,
FEPADE,
the Special
tenemos
Prosecutor's
el
Office for
tribunal.
Electoral Crimes, the
Es
Tribunal.
el órgano
And the most
de
important
Estado
institution of state
más
in the elections
importante
period
en tiempos del
is the
proceso electoral.
National Electoral Institute.
Y tiene
And it has all the
todas las
faculties to
facultades
act,
para actuar, decía Porfirio Muñoz Ledo,
said Porfirio
para
Muñoz Ledo,
actuar
to act
de
in an
manera
official
oficial,
manner,
siguiendo la ley,
following
o
the
de
letter
manera
of the law,
oficiosa,
or to act in an officious
promoviendo,
manner, promoting,
protegiendo,
protecting, respecting, and
respetando y
guaranteeing what you owe to
garantizando
this society,
lo que tú debes a la
which is
sociedad,
a real
que
representative
es la
democracy.
democracia representativa. Y le decía,
So
tú
Muñoz Ledo told him,
eres el árbitro
you are the
y
referee,
tienes que tener
and you
tus
have to have
tarjetas
your cards,
como el
like the
árbitro
referee in a soccer game,
en un
in a
de
soccer
fútbol,
match,
en una competencia de fútbol.
Without favoring one team or
Y
another.
sacar tus tarjetas,
and hold up your cards,
tarjeta amarilla,
the yellow card,
tarjeta
the red
roja.
card. We want,
Queremos
we're
nosotros
working
luchar
so that the public
porque esos
institutions
órganos
act
públicos
without
actúen sin
favoritism
filias
or
y
phobias,
sin fobias, de
in a
manera
timely manner,
oportuna, en
with
forma
firmness and resolve.
contundente y
We told that to the
Eso
president
ya
of the
se lo
National
dijimos
Electoral
al
Institute.
presidente del INE.
How do you take it?
Sí. Pienso que
I
algo
think that
nos
he paid
hizo
attention to us in some
caso,
way,
algo
because
algún
now that
caso
some
nos
big
hizo.
businesses came out very
Porque ahora
strongly
que los
against one
empresarios de
coalition,
los grandes
against one
corporativos
candidate, saying he was
se
a
pusieron
huge
muy exigentes
danger
en
to
contra de
Mexico,
una coalición
instead of saying that he represented a danger to their pocketbooks, but well, that he was a huge danger for Mexico and so on.
And pressuring their employees.
Lorenzo Córdoba,
Lorenzo
por
Córdoba
lo menos ya
at
comenzó a
least
decir,
began to say that
estaban en
they
el
were
límite
bordering on illegality.
de la ilegalidad. Para mí,
For me,
no estaban en el límite de
they
la
weren't
ilegalidad.
bordering on
Para mí
illegality.
estaban en
They
la
were over
ilegalidad,
the edge of illegality.
porque es una manera de presionar,
No? Because that's a
contra el
way of
voto
pressuring
libre y
against people's
personal de
right
la gente,
to a free and
tipo
secret
de
vote
desplante. Pero
with
bueno,
this kind of
Lorenzo, por lo
snuff.
menos dijo eso.
But Lorenzo Córdoba at
Está en
least
el
said
límite
this,
de
that
la
they were
ilegalidad.
bordering on illegality.
Pero
So we keep insisting that they have to act without favoritisms, without phobias, in a timely and firm way, and with complete transparency.
This project of organizing citizen observation efforts, both national and international, how do you see this pushing the electoral institutes to do their job and to actually apply the law?
I think it's necessary, not just useful, but necessary. I think this is the time when electoral observation, with this component of public and formal complaints and the use of the media, it is more necessary than ever. It's strange that in this year, in this electoral process, the government has not really promoted electoral observation. I think the government hasn't wanted this process to be closely watched. For this reason, it hasn't encouraged it. It has really limited the possibilities to carry out citizen observation in a lot of ways.
There seems to be a lot of interest, though, on the part of the people. Unfortunately, we've come very quickly to the end of the program, and I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. But what's clear is that historically, and especially at this point in Mexico, it's really been a mobilized citizenry that has to stand up for political rights and for political rights as human rights. And as a pioneer in this field with your decades of experience, it's been a real privilege to have you here on the show. Father Concha, thank you very much.
You are welcome. Thank you, Laura. Thank you.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.